Okay, as I already said, good afternoon. My presentation deals with exploring active approaches in teaching poetic texts. Very briefly about me, I have a master's degree from University of Sarajevo. I graduated summa cum laude and got 2 golden badges from the university in 2013. I'm currently doing an MBA at IBU. I was also a presenter at ALLT 2019, and my paper titled What's Culturally Responsive Research-Based Reading Instruction was published in the proceedings. Besides this, I write fiction in both Bosnian and English languages, and last year I published a poetry collection titled Beneath the Surface. Currently, I'm teaching high school English at Al Mawakib School in Garhoud in Dubai, and that over there is my website if you wish to know more. Now, when it comes to the presentation for today, these are some main discussion points that I'm going to be focusing on. It's content and meaning versus competency, assessment mechanisms. We're going to take a look at a few question samples from SATs and IGCSEs, and we're going to focus on active teaching approaches, tools, and strategies. Now, the first question is, why learn poetry in the first place? As educators, we know that poetry offers something that others form of writing do not really, and we seek to pass on this enjoyment of poetry to our students. It's also essential to the way we acquire language. Think about nursery rhymes. On the other hand, it has played a variety of roles in our societies over time. And of course, it's embedded in national curricula, and it's part of the assessment mechanisms in standardized tests. So ultimately, our goal as educators is to ease the students' understanding and boost their interest while developing these required competencies. Now, I'm going to briefly go through some of the questions from some of the past standardized tests, just to see what exact skills we're looking at here. And then later on, we're going to focus on strategies to actually teach these skills. So for instance, here, how does Bishop create a tone that is both serious and amusing in the poem One Art? This is from IGCSE from 2017. In what ways does Nichols use imagery to memorable effect in Praise Song for My Mother? Explore how Jones uses words and images to striking effects. And then from SAT prep test, the metaphor that opens the poem tells us that, and then offered answers. And the phrase seems nowhere to alight in line 3 is illustrated in which of the details. So as we can see from these various samples, is that these standardized tests kind of zoom in on a particular word or a phrase and then ask the students to identify the effect that this particular word choice has on the overall meaning of the entire poem. And this is the tricky bit. How do we get the students there to actually be able to understand these nuances in meaning and the effect that they have? And this is where these active approaches in teaching poetry come into play. So basically, the ultimate aim is to elicit curiosity, interest, participation, reflection, enjoyment, creativity, and involvement, which sounds almost impossible. And we accomplish this through form and structure, language and imagery, voice, tone, mood, and then eventually settings and themes. Now I'm going to go through some strategies to tackle these various aspects of teaching poetry. So when it comes to form and structure, we often use it as a springboard to look at the poem. So basically, students enjoy learning form and structure, and they learn these rules because they function like formulas that you can apply to many different poems. And also, traditional poetic forms have very colorful history. Think about Francesco Petrarch and his own background. Now, one particular type of poem that students enjoy learning is the ballad. Why? Because it reminds them of a short story. It has a plot, it has characters, it has a fixed structure, so it's quite straightforward, and they know what to expect. An interesting strategy to teach ballad would be a top-down strategy where students need to agree on rules for writing a ballad by analyzing an example of the poem. In this case, the teacher becomes the guide of the poetic form rather than provider of the information. They need to put together a class spider diagram showing ideas from all groups, and then later on, they need to engage their higher order thinking skills by reaching some kind of consensus on what are the most important rules, or what is the sequence of importance of the rules that they came up with, and eventually they check whether they were right or not by applying it to another poem. This is all fine until we get to something horrible, and that's free verse. And in their case, the initial reaction from the students here tends to be, it's not even a real poem, there's no rhyme, there's nothing to recognize, nothing to clutch on, to grasp at. And the students' lack of confidence in tackling the free verse form manifests itself in this initial resistance, which is basically fear and the feeling of being overwhelmed that happens when they understand that they need to look at multiple meanings, which is very alarming. They feel pressured because they need to search for these layers of meanings that aren't really obvious. And without any formal structures of these traditional poetic forms, it can be quite a daunting task. Another difficulty that can arise is imagery. And for example, here we have Thistles by Ted Hughes, and the language of the poem is very striking, very guttural, very harsh. It's supposed to evoke the image of thistles as Vikings. However, as Steiner says in his essay on difficulty, something that might be a challenge for the students is if they do not have the prior knowledge, or it's simply not the image that comes to their mind when they read the poem. So this is where we come into play as educators, and we need to help them. We need to basically prepare the ground for the poem in a way that is engaging and interesting to the students. We need to guide them in their research. We need to show them in what direction to think before they actually tackle the poem, so that we kind of open this poetic landscape to the students. When it comes to thistles, we can emphasize these stereotypical images of Vikings that Ted Hughes himself focuses on in the poems. And we get there also by asking the right kind of questions that would get the students thinking along the right lines. Another way to tackle poetry is by basically ripping it apart in a way by annotation. This is a sample from one of my own online sessions where grade 9 was supposed to analyze the effect of figurative language on the tone of the poem. And as you can see, they use different colors to identify different figures of speech, from simile to personification and so on. They annotated some of the verses that they found imaginative and creative, and they eventually concluded that the tone is kind of humorous and silly. And then they continued with the rest of the poem, and they amended their, because it's called Ode to My Socks, they amended their initial opinion. It's supposed to seem serious, but it's actually silly. And you can see how their thinking process went and how they basically relied on figures of speech in order to get to this conclusion. Now, when it comes to voice, this is another thing that might be confusing, because students tend to confuse it with mood, with tone, and so on. And it's a good thing to remind them of the origins of poetry, which is basically linked to song. And here we have Homer, who's summoning his muses, right? So the poet is here basically presented as the voice of the imagination. And a very versatile strategy to teach voice is Socratic seminar. Socratic seminar is a versatile strategy to teach basically almost anything. However, here it's proven very good, especially with the, I don't know, a poem such as My Last Touches by Robert Browning. And basically what is the best way to inspire students' interest and curiosity is to answer their questions with further questions. It allows them to gain a sense of basic situation of the poem, and it encourages some independence of thought. Now, when it comes to Socratic seminar and the procedures for Socratic seminar, they require quite a bit of preparation from the part of the student, and also they require quite a bit of practice in terms of classroom procedures. So when it comes to the students, they need to have already read the poem, they need to have already thought about the poem, conducted research, established connections to the self, other texts, the world, and they need to have prepared open-ended questions. When it comes to the quality of the questions, this is where you can provide them with question stems to make sure that they are targeting the right kind of questions, and this is later on they should be able to do it independently without any assistance. The teacher's role overall is to allow the students to run the discussion. Now, from this participation rubric, you can see that the ultimate goal is for them to participate, to encourage participation of others, and to have some sort of an independent discussion. Mind you, not a debate, because there's no right and wrong side here. So they need to follow the discussion rules, be polite, respectful, and so on. And these rules can be displayed somewhere either in the classroom or online. They need to encourage discussion from quieter members. And the ultimate goal is to be active and participate. And this is from the inner circle. The outer circle, on the other hand, is paired up usually with the inner circle members. They need to observe, take notes, evaluate participation, and then later on they can take turns in questioning the members of the inner circle. If they want to contribute to the discussion, they can take the place at the hot seat. When it comes to this, I've tried doing so. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. So I've tried doing this in many different settings, from distance learning to these mixed settings that we have now, half in class, half online, and so on. And they're very versatile and adaptable, and they work very well. When it comes to teaching the setting itself, a good way to do it, and a good example here would be offered by the band by Seamus Heaney, is to illustrate or draw or provide a picture of the setting, and then they label different parts from the poem by using quotes and by using figures of speech. And the most daunting thing to teach probably is the theme itself. It requires a bit of research where students might need some guidance. A good activity would be to sequence the poem. So basically you rip it apart, the stanzas, into separate pieces, and then they need to put it all together and explain why this is the right sequence and what is the overarching idea that holds the thing together, which is basically the theme. And another way to do it is the opposite way, which would be to rip it apart by annotating, and by annotating all of the different aspects that would eventually, as you can see here in grade 10, where they were determining the theme of those winter Sundays, they annotated everything from figures of speech, the speaker, tone, mood, and so on, which led them finally to the theme itself, which is appreciate the small acts of care or love. And this would be it when it comes to my presentation. I hope you found it useful, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your timely presentation, because I was ready for a couple of more minutes since we started a bit late, but thank you for being on time. I'm sorry if I did not pronounce your name, your surname correctly. I think it's very difficult to understand how I pronounce it.
That's okay. This is something that I'm quite used to. It's Grcic. And yes, I'm Bosnian, so yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was really surprised to see there Homer and Socrates coming from Greece and all. So I was very pleased to see that. Thank you very much. The discussion, the question part is at the end of this panel, so we will see. Let's move on now. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation.